Alright, so for this demo I figured we would just get into the thick of things and just talk about it as we go. So while we are talking about modeling, we're going to be talking about using curves and using modifiers and kind of modeling sloppily and cleaning it up. So I'm actually going to control N and start over so I can narrate what's going on a little easier for you guys. So I'm going to select the cube, left click, X, delete, and Shift A, add a plane. And this is our plane. So for this plane, we want to add a modifier. So I'm going to press Control Spacebar to get out of full screen. And we're going to go over to the modifier panel and we're going to add a bevel modifier. And we're going to choose only vertices and play with the offset and add additional segments. Maybe not so many, maybe about 12. And lower the amount. And here we are with our beveled object. And of course, since this is a modifier, it's non-destructive. But really none of that matters because we're going to go under object and we're going to convert it to a curve. And after converting it to a curve, we'll turn this into a 2D mesh and we'll fill both sides. And under geometry of the curve panel, we want to adjust the depth. But first we must extrude it. So we want to extrude it, lower the resolution, and then adjust the depth. And now we have this like beveled, thickened curve that's rounded on the sides. Even though we can't adjust the sides anymore, it doesn't really matter. The interesting thing about curves is that while we're dealing with it in this 2D state, it looks like a mesh, but it isn't a mesh, it's a curve. And what that means is that if we go in edit mode and we shift A, which brings up the add menu. Keep in mind we're doing this in edit mode. If we shift A, add a circle, this circle is now cutting into this. This is like one of the oldest tricks in the book. And the only reason I bring this up is because this is one of those legacy things with Blender. So right now I'm just pressing G to move this circle around, S to scale, and my scaling isn't on. So this means that when I'm moving by holding control, I'm actually snapping to an increment. But because snap isn't on, it does it when I press control. If I have it on, it'll just do it all the time, which is kind of annoying. I like sometimes having it under a control press. So we'll just put a circle there. We'll put another circle like right here. It doesn't really matter. And so from here, I'm going to show you another hotkey, and that is Control A. And Control A is typically used to apply location, rotation, or scale, which you can do them all at the same time under all transforms. This is a major part of using Blender. Look at it like deleting your history, except it has nothing to do with your undo history at all in Blender. We're just talking about your origin and your transforms, basically. Maybe more like 3ds Max's freeze transformations. I don't know. I don't use these programs. So what we want to use here is actually visual geometry to mesh, which will actually turn what we have selected into a mesh, no matter what, no questions asked. And when we do this, we have this thing that's a mesh. So far, so good, right? We tap into edit mode. I know what you're thinking. What am I looking at? You don't even have any idea. So pressing 1 switches you to vertex mode. Pressing 2 puts you in edge mode. And pressing 3 will put you in face mode. The interesting thing about face mode is that if you press L in face mode, it'll select a continuous selection of geometry. And so by pressing G and moving my mouse around, you can see that while this is a good looking result, it's not a good result because this mesh is separated, which is, kind of rubbish to be honest. So we'll select everything. Press 1 to go into vertice mode, and we're going to just right click and choose merge by distance. Right click is actually a context menu that has appropriate options depending on what you're up to. In fact, we can see shade smooth and shade flat there, which is how we'll be dealing with smoothing and flattening. And then of course just going to normals and auto smooth for the fine adjustments. Now all the geometry has been merged together. So if I press 3, you can see that when I press L, it just selects everything. So we want to take advantage of that. We'll press C and use circle select. Keep in mind, this is like a kind of a live demo of how I would work in action. I figured this would be the best way to get you guys acquainted with the hotkey. Pressing C to get into circle mode again. We'll hold shift and just click that to deselect it. With all of this geometry selected, I'm going to press X and we're going to choose limited dissolve. And limited dissolve will let Blender do its best to get rid of as much geometry as it can. The stuff that's left is actually all that these circles need to survive, to hang on to life. So in order to resolve this, I'm going to use something called the knife tool, which if you press K in edit mode, it brings up the knife tool. I'm going to snap it to the first vert and press C, which C is actually mentioned at the bottom of the screen here, where it says C add angle constraint on. So we're just angle constraining it and just cutting here. We're going to press E to end that cut, grab that vert, and cut it straight to success. Same here, all we want are just straight lines. Any of these things stressing the edges aren't going to work out for what we're going to do next. So we'll do one more right here. So pressing K and then C to make it straight, cutting it here. And so because of that, I can now press 2 to go into edge mode. We'll select this edge and this edge and this edge, and we'll just get rid of all these little pieces I no longer desire. And by doing this, this is basically a cleaned up in-gone piece. You might be looking at it thinking, hey, that geometry is just terrible. That'll never work. But believe me, it'll work. I mean, geometry is just geometry. So I'm going to hold Alt, or actually I guess I don't have to hold Alt. I'll just double click that loop, hold Shift, double click that loop, and press Control plus to grow my selection. And so we're going to set up a hotkey at this point because, you know, things are going to get old real fast. And I've been doing this for about 10 years, so I'm not trying to take everything all the way back to the fundamentals. So we're going to right click, select boundary loop, and choose assign shortcut, and we're going to press Shift tilde. So from now on, when we press Shift tilde with a selection, it's going to select a boundary loop. And we're going to press Control E, mark seam, and we're just going to mark it as a seam. We're going to mark it as a sharp. That's all I feel like doing right now. And by doing that, we can, we can also select this, Shift tilde, Control E, mark seam, mark sharp. You might notice that that becomes a pattern. By opening the preferences and just saving the preferences, it ensures that the next time we use Blender, that these hotkeys persist, because all the hotkeys that we set up over the course of this are going to be how we work, from here on. Our goal is to, learn these fundamentals and then also evolve as we pick these things up. But continuing on, so we got our geometry here, and it's so. If we were to try to deform it, it would not work out. In fact, just to humor you guys, we'll put a simple deform modifier on it and do a bend, and you can see that we're just not getting a good result here. Any way we look at this, because of our geometry is so simple, but because we're kind of partitioning areas off, things are about to get simpler. So another useful tip is we can select a face, and by holding Control, you can select from one face all the way to another one. So I'm just going to select that one, hold Control, select all the way there, and do it on all sides here, and just hide that. We'll press 3 to go into face mode, and because we mark these with seams, not for UV purposes, but to press L and select just that link geometry and hide it. And all we want to be exposed is the geometry that we're going to be dealing with very shortly. So let's just Shift A, and we're going to add a grid this time. We're just going to move that up, scale it up a little bit, and this is what we have for a grid. And to be honest, I'm going to want to subdivide that maybe 2 more times by just right clicking and choosing subdivide. And after getting a couple of subdivisions in there, we'll press X and we will remove only faces. So we have this edge matrix now, right? And we have this mesh underneath. So we'll shift select the mesh underneath, tab in edit mode, maybe Alt Z to not see through it. That's what made me have to get out of top mode. And you remember I was talking about how spacebar is your friend for options that you just can't find? Well, spacebar, and we're going to type in knife project. Keep in mind that right now I have 2 separate objects selected, and even though it looks like I'm in edit mode on one combined mesh, these are 2 separate objects that are in edit mode together. So if you're coming from 2.79, that is something that's very new to 2.8 is multi-object edit mode, but I think it's pretty nice. And we'll just do a knife project. I can just tell you from experience that we're going to need to click this box that says cut through. And when we do that, it now cuts all the way to the other side, which let's take this grid and we'll just press X and delete it and just look at what we have. And we could actually, just double click a few edges that we added at the beginning and get rid of them. They're not needed anymore. But if we look underneath, you can see that if we wouldn't have cleaned it up the way that we did, this would have been our result. So if we press Alt H, we have all of our geo back. And this was kind of what I was going for. And this is what I was trying to avoid. Because if we were to deform this, this would not look satisfactory. So the next thing I want to introduce you to is the mirror modifier in 2.8. Back in the day, you used to have to split your mesh down the middle and delete half the geo, and it was terrible. I got tired of it. It was so terrible. But one of the first things they added in 2.8 was a new mirror modifier. And so we'll just turn that on real quick. And before we continue, let's turn on wireframe as well, because we want to see exactly what's going on. So we have it on X. We want to turn on bisect, and we want to turn on flip. And so now we're mirroring across here, but we're cutting it down the middle and merging that geometry on the level of the modifier. And because of that, this geometry is completely watertight and manifold. So it's prime for booleans, but also it's a good mesh. So we can take this a step further. Let's also mirror it on the Y. We'll need to bisect it. And you see if I flip it, it'll actually take this side and put it on this side, basically undoing what we did previously. And if we uncheck it, it will put what is on this side over on this side, which is the result that we're after on both sides. So this is our final result. If we look underneath, you can see that this is a disaster and we don't want to talk about that. But let's talk about it. Click on Z, bisect, and what problem? That is done. So on to the next phase. So we'll Shift A, add a grid. We'll scale this up. And this time, this grid is going to have a special purpose. We're going to put a solidify on it. Set the offset to maybe 1. Maybe set the offset to 0.5. All right, maybe set the offset to 0. And we just want our grid that has a solidification to encompass it. But we don't want our grid to obscure what we made underneath, because that's the real meat and potatoes of this. So under viewport display, we'll make this display as wire, which you can see that this is something that you wouldn't want to have to deal with. We could make a shortcut for it, but it's not that important. But just know that we'll need to deal with that someday. So this object is called grid, and this object is called plane. Really simple. So we come down here and we add a mesh deform. And with mesh deform, we'll select grid. And before we continue, we want to just take this grid, tab into edit mode, and by pressing Alt Z, we can already see through the object. And you can see that I have everything selected. So I'll press Shift tilde, or a hotkey for select boundary, and we'll press Q. Sorry, thinking about something else in another universe. We're going to mark this as a crease, and we want to just type 1. So up here you can see crease, and there's some numericals. We're just going to type 1 and press enter because I just want to crease it to max. And if we press Control 1, we add a sub D modifier. Press Control 2, we add a level 2 subdivision modifier. And what I want to do is press Control 1. We only want to add a 1 level subdivision modifier, but we want to move it above the solidify. So basically it solidifies it after it adds the subdivision. Otherwise, it'll round the corners off, which is something we don't want. The next thing from here is to actually select the main object, and we want to bind it. So we click on that, and it makes us hold for just a moment. And now we can actually test the fruits of our labor. So I'm just grabbing these 4 verts, and we're just deforming this. So let's turn off overlays and see what we have here. So now we have this object perfectly ready to deform, and we really didn't spend a whole lot of time at all putting this thing together. So continuing on with this example, for the sake of time, we want to Shift A, bring about an empty. So under empties are basically like null objects. If you're familiar with After Effects, I'm sure they exist in every application. And because of the power of right click, we're able to right click an empty. You can right click an empty, a mesh, a lattice, anything, and get a right click menu for it. So we're going to right click the empty and adjust the empty draw size. And we're just going to move that up. And we're going to press Shift S and snap cursor to selected, and then Shift A, single arrow. And what we want is for this to point directly out. All right, continuing on. So at this point, what we want to do is bring in a sphere. So the UV sphere isn't my favorite sphere, so I'll just go ahead and introduce you to the concept of making a correct sphere. So with this cube, we'll press Control 3, which will put a subdivision modifier on it. But if we really press 1 and numpad period to focus on front view and zoom in on this, it doesn't really look very spherical. So by adding a cast modifier and setting the factor to 1, we can actually add additional volume to this and get this to look just like a sphere, and a little bit more subdivision. And we can actually even right click this and shade smooth, and it looks pretty good. But we see that our shadows don't look so good anymore, so I'm actually going to go and mess with the shadows a little bit. Alright, we'll just have to live with it. So we'll take this, move it down below. We can always just turn shadows off if it became too problematic. And we'll scale this up by pressing S and just GZ to move it down the Z axis. And we're going to take this particular empty, which is just an arrow. This one's just an empty that's a sphere. None of these have their scales changed. That's just how they were born. We're going to select the sphere, and we're going to press spacebar and choose track 2, or just track, and you'll see an option for make track, and you see that it also has no hotkey. This used to be Control T, so this is just one of those growing pains I've had to get used to with 2.8. So you can see that the empty is now pointed somewhere, but it's not really pointed in the direction that we want. So by going to the properties panel, we can see that we want to change this to maybe be Z, and the up will need to be Y. And now it's actually pointed with it being on Z and the up being Y. If we take this and move it, you can see that they're pointed, and you're probably wondering where this is going. So we'll select this object and actually parent it to the empty. like so. So now if we rotate the sphere, this object will be pointed at it. And one of the goals of this particular exercise was to introduce you guys to the concept of shrink wrap. So if we take this model and we shrink wrap it to this object, you can now see what we're going for here. However, due to the modifier order, this isn't the desired result. So let's actually select the object that went wrong, look at its order, see where we went wrong here. It's subdividing it, then solidifying it, then shrink wrapping it. Now, personally, I think that if it were to shrink wrap it before all of this, it would be fine. In fact, move it up one level, it's fine. Move it up 2 levels, it's perfect. So at this point, we want to actually change this to be project. And when we project, we want to project on the Z negatively, of course. And there should be an option here for subsurf levels, which will determine the amount of smoothing. So the final part of this experiment is to take this piece that now we can have aligned to the sphere however we want. We could take this, select this, use Control P, parent, and we want to parent it by keeping the transform. And now we can move this and just position this as we want on the sphere. So I will press Alt H in order to unhide the sphere, and let's just give this a try. We'll take these 2 items and just press H to hide them. Select this, and let's say I wanted to duplicate this and actually get a little more experimental with it. I could press Shift G, which selects group and brings up this handy little menu, also available in edit mode with very different options. We'll select children. It'll deselect everything and select children. So we'll need to select the main object, and we'll just duplicate it one more time and just move it over so we can isolate which empty that is. And we'll just place that variant of the plate. And so to show that one more time, I'll press Shift G, select this, children, and we'll just duplicate this over to create a plate there. Select it, Shift G, and we'll just make one here. And this is just one way you can deal with curving ingond meshes in particular. I know it can be a little tricky dealing with curvature and ingonds, and there's a large contingency of people who are quite against ingonds out there. So I do want to show some friendly ways of working with them and getting effective results with them over the course of this, because I do feel that they get a bad rap, and there's definitely a reason they exist in 3D, and it isn't for shits and giggles. It's definitely there for modeling purposes. And when it comes to hard surface, they definitely are quite powerful when it comes to managing surfaces and kind of getting these levels of control that you really can't get with subdivision due to the additional geometric density. So sometimes at the end of the day, you do have to grid things up in order to get it to be able to deform right, as you see that I had to here. However, for the most part with planar objects, such things are unnecessary. But I just wanted to just kind of go through this quick example and just show you guys how I would approach such a model, and we'll at least finish covering this thing up before I get out of here. So we'll press Shift G, select children, select this. And we'll just duplicate one more time, just cut out the middleman. Usually in these workflows, as I do things over and over, I'll eventually just start cutting out steps until things just start making more sense. If we turn off render overlays, you can kind of see what we got here for this example. So keep in mind that this was made from just a plane dealing with a curve, and then all of a sudden at the end we have this thing deforming around a polysphere that we added. So with that, we'll wrap this thing up